Number 11. Co-eds caught making money on the side. Any self-supporting college student knows that it can be tough to get the bills paid while maintaining good grades. Instead of burning the wick at both ends, some young adults look for creative ways to rake in enough cash without sacrificing study time. But the decision to work smart rather than work hard came with harsh consequences for a trio of suspects from Florida who were accused of running a prostitution ring while attending university in early 2017. University of Miami students Acacia Jericho Friedman and Maury Noun, aged 23 and 21 years old at the time of their arrests, and 19-year-old Florida International University student Samara Charlatan were nabbed in the city of Coral Gables after allegedly negotiating a pay-to-play deal with an undercover cop. According to authorities, Noun was the organization's acting pimp. He was accused of meeting up with the undercover and offering the services of Friedman and Charlatan for $5,000 plus a $3,000 broker's fee. The undercover forked over the cash after turning down an offer of unprotected fund for an upcharge, then signaled to his fellow officers to move in and make the arrests. Noun, Friedman and Charlatan were released on bail after being held on multiple prostitution and drug charges. Authorities charged Noun with deriving support from prostitution, directing another to prostitution, and aiding or abetting prostitution. Charlatan and Friedman were charged with engaging in prostitution, while Charlatan faced an additional charge for OxyContin and marijuana possession. While the legal consequences of the case are unclear, it was likely punishment enough for the trio to endure the embarrassment of making national news headlines for their accused crimes. Number 10. Madison Brooks. 19-year-old Louisiana State University student Madison Brooks was served alcohol at a bar in Baton Rouge one evening in January 2023 despite being underage. Surveillance footage would later show her stumbling, falling, and struggling to stand in what appeared to be a visibly intoxicated state. She was also seen leaving the bar with 4 young men sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Just an hour or two later, Madison was fatally struck by a car. She had been left alone in the middle of a road. Her blood alcohol content was nearly 4 times the legal limit. What at first seemed like an unfortunate tragedy was soon labeled a crime by the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office, who accused 4 suspects of assaulting Madison in a vehicle and dumping her onto the pavement like trash. 18-year-old Kaysen Carver, 18-year-old Kayvon DeAndre Washington, 28-year-old Everett Lee, and an unnamed 4th suspect face various charges in connection with the incident. Under the definition of the crime that 2 of the men are accused of, a victim is considered too incapacitated by drugs or alcohol to consent to physical relations, and a perpetrator is aware of the victim's inability to consent. The 2 other men were charged with being present during the assault, but not directly participating in it, and failing to take action in an attempt to stop it from happening. But there are multiple sides to every story, and all 4 suspects remain innocent until proven guilty in the eyes of the law. And while the case has understandably generated widespread outrage, the American justice system is designed to give every defendant a fair shake, no matter how despicable their alleged crime. According to some analysts, the case will most likely center around a few main arguments, including whether Madison was capable of consenting, and if so, whether she consented or not, and whether she was coherent when she exited the vehicle, or if she was dumped on the road in an obviously incapacitated state. Number 9. Tina Stewart and Shanta Madden. College dorm life does not always come with a choice of roommate, and while colleges often do their best to match compatible students with one another, sometimes they miss the mark. It didn't take very long for Middle Tennessee State University students Tina Stewart and Shanta Madden to realize they were a bad fit after moving into a shared campus apartment in 2011. Tina was a straight-laced star basketball player, while Shanta was more of a laid-back type who enjoyed smoking marijuana but still cared about her studies. For a short time, the women got along decently, but the relationship quickly turned sour when Tina's boyfriend began staying at the apartment for prolonged periods, including when Tina herself was not there. Shanta complained about the situation, and college officials tried to arrange a sit-down meeting with the roommates. But the differences between the two women soon spiraled out of control and devolved into a bitter rivalry. Angered by Shanterica's complaints, Tina began playing her music loudly in a bid to further annoy her already irritated roommate. She also called the police on Shanterica and her friends for smoking weed when they didn't realize Tina was home. Tina claimed she was worried about testing positive for marijuana from exposure to second-hand smoke, which would disqualify her from her basketball scholarship. But according to court documents, a series of enraged tweets directed at Shanterica indicated that Tina was mostly motivated to report the marijuana use by the women's personal dislike of one another. After learning that Tina had called the police, Shanterica approached her bedroom door and demanded to speak with her. Just when it seemed like the women couldn't get any more like oil and water, a physical altercation broke out between the two. Shanterica stabbed Tina during the fight, and Tina died from her injuries, bringing the senseless feud to a tragic end. And instead of looking forward to a bright future as a college graduate, Shanterica instead found herself in a courtroom facing a murder charge at just 20 years old. She was also accused of tampering with evidence for trying to hide the knife that she stabbed Tina with. Shanterica was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. She'll be 40 years old when she becomes eligible for parole in 2034. The case is especially tragic, not only because it ended in a needless act of preventable violence, but because two young women lost their promising futures in an instant, with one life taken and another ruined. Number 8. Bryce Laspa. After wrapping up a successful first year studying industrial and graphic design at Sierra College in Chico, California in 2013, 19-year-old Bryce Laspa returned 7 hours south to his family's home in Orange County for the summer. As the fall semester approached later that year, he moved back up north where he lived with his close friend and roommate Sean Dixon. He was also in a happy relationship with a fellow student named Kim Sly, who would later recall that Laspa seemed eager to start the fall semester. Just a few weeks later, Dixon and Sly noticed a disturbing shift in Laspa's personality. He had started abusing stimulant medication meant for patients with ADHD, despite not having an ADHD diagnosis, for a late-night burst of energy and to improve his video gaming skills. The pills seemed to have a negative impact on Laspa, who became increasingly erratic, withdrawn, and reckless. He also began to abuse alcohol, which only seemed to exacerbate his symptoms. Less than 2 weeks after classes began, Laspa broke up with Sly over text message, telling her she'd be better off without him. Around the same time, he gave Dixon his Xbox and some diamond jewelry that had been passed down through generations of his family. Knowing how much these items meant to Bryce, Dixon called his buddy's mom, Karen, and let her know that he was worried about the young man's well-being. Later that night, Sly took Laspa's car keys away after he showed up at her home acting completely out of sorts. She suspected that Laspa was loaded up on booze and stimulants and did not think he was in a safe condition to drive. Sly gave the keys back at the urging of Laspa's mother, who told her son to go home and rest. Laspa left Sly's apartment shortly before midnight and called Karen again around 1:30 in the morning. He didn't mention that he was on the road, but records would later show that he was driving along a highway about an hour south of his apartment. Later that morning, Karen and her husband discovered that Bryce had used the family's roadside assistance membership. The man who assisted the teen told his parents that he had delivered a few gallons of gas to Laspa after he ran out of fuel along a roadside. At the family's request, the shop owner returned to where he had dropped the gasoline off. Laspa was still sitting in his car in the exact same spot, even though more than 5 hours had passed since the fuel had been delivered. With some encouragement from the man providing roadside assistance, Laspa finally started his car and began to drive toward his family's home, which was just 3 hours away. When Bryce failed to show up at his parents' house hours later and wasn't answering his phone, they reported him missing. Following the GPS signal from Laspa's phone, law enforcement tracked him down just a handful of miles from the roadside where he had received the gas delivery. He was acting perfectly normal, according to the officers, who had no reason to detain him after failing to observe any signs that he was a danger to himself or others. They also found no drugs or alcohol in his car. Several more hours later, at around 2:00 a.m., Laspa called his mom and said he was stopping to sleep along the roadside. 6 hours after that, a cop showed up at his parents' door and told them that Bryce's car had been found abandoned near Castaic Lake. The vehicle had crashed and Bryce's phone, laptop and wallet were found inside the car, but he was nowhere to be seen, and he hasn't been seen since. Instead of stopping to rest, Laspa had turned onto an access road. He was seen driving up and down the road at least twice over a 2-hour period during the pre-dawn hours. Evidence from the scene of the car crash showed that Laspa drove over a 25-foot embankment with his foot pressed to the gas. It's unclear what happened after that. An extensive search involving police, divers, canines, and helicopters failed to turn up any sign of Bryce. More than 10 years later, the Laspizas are still looking for their son. Some investigators suspect that the combination of stimulants and alcohol that Bryce was abusing prior to his disappearance may have caused him to experience a psychotic event. Others believe he vanished on purpose and is still alive, or that he may be suffering from a brain injury he sustained during the car crash and might not remember who he is. During one of his last conversations with his mother, Bryce told Karen that he needed to talk to her about something important. Knowing what he wanted to discuss could prove to be the missing piece of information that investigators need to solve the case, but they're unfortunately not sure if they'll ever be able to answer that question. Number 7. Suzanne Jovin. 21-year-old Suzanne Jovin moved to the United States from Germany to pursue an education at Yale University during the late 1990s. Tragedy unexpectedly shook the prestigious university's campus and the surrounding community of New Haven, Connecticut during the young woman's senior year in December 1998, when she was viciously stabbed to death by a killer who remains at large to this day. Less than an hour before her death, the young woman mentioned in an email to a friend that she was meeting someone to retrieve some books they had borrowed from her. She never mentioned the person's name, the individual was never identified, and it's unclear whether Suzanne ever met up with the person. The last known person to see Suzanne alive was her classmate Peter Stein, who crossed paths with the woman during her walk back to campus from a local volunteer job. Stein, who is not a suspect in the case, told investigators that Suzanne was acting completely normal. Suzanne's remains were found dumped in an upscale and typically safe neighborhood just over a mile off campus during the evening hours. Nearby residents reported hearing screams shortly before the body was discovered, but only one witness came forward claiming to have gotten a close glimpse at the suspected killer. The witness told police that a man had jumped out in front of her car no more than a half-mile from where Suzanne was left to die, with 17 stab wounds to her arms, back and neck. According to the woman's description, the suspect was in his 20s or 30s and had chiseled facial features. She claimed that the man was running fast, in her words, like his life depended on it. People with insider knowledge on the case later accused investigators of brushing off the witness's tip because they were focused on Suzanne's academic advisor, who was eventually cleared of any suspicion in the case. The murder remains unsolved to this day, despite a 6-figure reward being offered for information leading to the arrest of a suspect and help from experts who have worked extensively on the case. DNA found beneath Suzanne's fingernails and a partial palm print found on another piece of evidence have yet to be identified, but could prove key in solving the case. Number 6. Chun Michael Deng. Hazing is proven to be dangerous, and it's banned in many, if not most, college campuses across the United States. Yet this age-old practice continues in the name of tradition, and there's no shortage of eager pledges who are willing to put their safety on the line for the opportunity to belong to the sorority or fraternity of their choosing. Such was the case for a college freshman and first-generation American named Chun Michael Deng, who sought a sense of community after beginning classes at Baruch College in New York City during the fall of 2013. Instead of attending university far away, Deng stayed close to his childhood home in Queens. Tragedy unexpectedly struck as his first semester came to an end in December of that year, when Deng was rushed to a Pennsylvania emergency room with life-threatening head injuries. He died the next day. The series of events leading to Deng's death began during his initiation into Baruch's Asian American fraternity, Pi Delta Psi, at a rented cabin in the Pocono Mountains. Unlike the vast majority of hazing cases, the 18-year-old did not have any alcohol in his system when he was rushed to the hospital, leaving investigators stumped about the cause of his injuries. Police were equally baffled by the fact that none of the young men who brought Deng to the hospital seemed intoxicated, yet they were not giving the level of detail that a sober person is normally able to provide after witnessing an emergency. The students didn't even want to admit that they were fraternity members, according to investigators, who described being met with a wall of silence in their efforts to determine why and how Deng died. After getting to the bottom of what law enforcement called a cover-up, they learned that Deng sustained his lethal injuries in a ritual known as the glass ceiling. During the initiation, a new pledge is blindfolded and met with escalating aggression as he tries to navigate through a literal wall of fraternity members. According to authorities, Deng was knocked around so severely that he was eventually unable to stand on his own, and his speech became slurred. He was pressured to continue, but fell motionless after a severe blow from one of the frat's leaders, Kenny Kwan. As Deng's condition deteriorated, more than 24 fraternity members at the property focused on hiding items bearing the name of their organization. They finally took him to the hospital nearly an hour after he became unresponsive. A forensic pathologist concluded that the delay played a direct contributing role to Deng's death. Most of the 37 suspects who were criminally charged in the case were sentenced to probation. The frat members who faced the most severe charges, Kenny Kwan, Charles Lay, Raymond Lam, and Sheldon Wong, were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison terms ranging between 1 and 2 years. In addition to the individual punishments, the fraternity was slapped with a 6-figure fine. Number 5. David Josiah Lawson. What began as a regular off-campus house party in Arcata, California, took an unexplained and deadly turn for 19-year-old Humboldt State University student David Josiah Lawson, who was stabbed to death during the early morning hours of April 15, 2017. It's unclear exactly what happened leading up to Lawson's murder due to the number of conflicting stories witnesses have given to police. By the time responding officers arrived at the scene around 3 a.m. in response to a call about a large, aggressive crowd, Lawson had been stabbed and his friend was trying to perform CPR on him. Lawson's friend Elijah Chandler later accused the police of lying in their report, which claimed that the officers immediately began life-saving efforts on the unresponsive young man. Chandler claimed that he was the sole person performing CPR on Lawson until paramedics arrived, and that the emergency responders failed to treat the situation with the urgency it deserved. He also claimed he had overheard 2 white women nearby wishing death on Lawson, who was African American, and calling him derogatory names. Officials have stood by their claims that they did everything they could to try saving Lawson, who was declared dead at a nearby hospital. Meanwhile, investigators recovered the murder weapon at the scene, but failed to glean any usable fingerprints from it. Authorities initially charged a 24-year-old white man named Kyle Zollner with Lawson's murder. During a court hearing, Zollner admitted to getting into a physical fight with Lawson at the party, but denied stabbing him. The charges were dropped after the judge overseeing the case concluded that there was not enough evidence to move forward with the case. In a statement, Humboldt University expressed its disappointment in the court's decision to dismiss the charges. The institution vowed to continue cooperating with the investigation in hopes of ensuring that justice would be served. More than 6 years later, Lawson's loved ones are still waiting. The most frustrating aspect of the case is that there are definitely people who know what happened that night. After all, the fight happened in plain view of numerous partygoers. Family, friends, community members, and activists are also upset by what seems like a lack of urgency to solve the case, which they say stands in stark contrast to law enforcement's response to past incidents involving missing and murdered white college students. As the 6th anniversary of Lawson's murder approached in 2023, the slain man's mother, Charmaine, called on authorities to step up their efforts to bring justice in her son's death. She was disappointed with the slow progress of the newly elected district attorney's independent review of the case, which she had initially expected to result in criminal charges against Lawson's suspected killer or killers. Charmaine's frustration is understandable. After all, no mother sends her child to college expecting for them to end up dead, or for their killer to get away with it. But that's what has happened so far, leaving Lawson's loved ones wondering if justice will ever truly be served. Number 4. Suzanne Lyle. 19-year-old Suzanne Lyle was in her sophomore year at the State University of New York's Albany campus in 1998 when she disappeared on the way home from her part-time job at a local mall. She was last seen getting off a public bus and beginning the walk to her dorm shortly before 9:30 p.m. on March 2nd. More than 25 years later, authorities seem no closer to finding the young woman than they were on the very night she vanished, seemingly into thin air. Suzanne was a good kid, according to her family. Sewing, writing poetry, and computer programming were among her favorite activities. Hardly the hobbies of a high-risk lifestyle that is sometimes seen in missing persons cases. In fact, she was so focused on her studies as a computer science major that she had almost no time to engage in risky behavior. The case served as a sobering reminder that even if a person isn't looking for trouble, sometimes it finds them anyway. In Suzanne's case, it happened during the less than 950-foot walk from the bus stop to her dorm. As soon as they received the news that Suzanne was missing, her family sprang into action and searched tirelessly for any sign of her. In the meantime, law enforcement canvassed a 400-acre area encompassing the campus, the mall where Suzanne worked, and a large swath of wilderness. Nothing in Suzanne's dorm room appeared disturbed, and no clues were ever found to indicate what might have happened to her. Speaking with ABC News in early 2023, the New York State Police declined to go into detail about whether the co-ed's boyfriend was ruled out as a suspect, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation. It's unfortunately very unlikely that the young woman is alive. She had no reason to run off and start a new life when she was just starting out and had a bright future ahead of her. And even brilliant people like Suzanne usually lack the resources to disappear without a trace. Her family knows she's most likely not alive, but they continue to pour their energy into finding answers. The Lyles have also advocated fiercely for other missing persons and their loved ones, including by advocating for a federal law called Suzanne's Law. Signed by former President George W. Bush in 2003, the law banned law enforcement from imposing a mandatory waiting period on reporting missing persons between 18 and 21 years of age. Number 3. Tyler Marie Thomas. As outdoor temperatures plunged into the teens on a frigid autumn night in 2010, 19-year-old Tyler Marie Thomas left an off-campus party and set out on foot for her dorm room at Peru State College in Nebraska. She had just gotten into an argument with her best friend and was reportedly intoxicated as she began the trek back to campus. Tyler was just a few hundred feet from her dorm when she was last seen at around 1:30 in the morning. A few minutes later, she sent a text message to a friend saying she didn't know where she was. She hasn't been seen or heard from since. The young woman's friends were immediately worried for her safety, not only because she seemed disoriented, but because they recalled seeing her leave the party with no jacket on. They reported Tyler missing at around 3 o'clock in the morning, roughly 90 minutes after she was last seen walking near her dorm. One of the first people to fall under the suspicion of investigators was a young man named Joshua Keedle, who also attended Peru State College. According to Tyler's friends, Keedle had romantic feelings for the missing woman, who decided she wasn't interested after going out on a date with a fellow student. These suspicions were only heightened after a woman accused Keedle of assaulting her about a month before Thomas vanished. He has since been convicted in 2 major assault cases against women, but has continued to adamantly deny his involvement in Thomas's disappearance. Keedle nevertheless remained on detectives' radar as they became increasingly convinced that he killed Thomas. According to police, he gave conflicting stories about the events of that night and eventually admitted that Thomas had been in his car on the night she went missing. He claimed he left her on a boat dock along the Missouri River after they got into an argument, but authorities believe he murdered her and dumped her body into the water. Despite having no body, prosecutors decided to move forward with a first-degree murder case against Keedle in 2017. After the charge was announced, a jailhouse informant told investigators that Keedle had admitted to murdering Thomas and that he had bragged about how he'd got away with it because law enforcement would never find her body. A jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 71 years in prison. But Thomas's body still has not been found. Number 2. Antonio Sealas. 18-year-old college freshman Antonio Sealas vanished during Parents' Weekend at Cornell University after moving to the upstate New York campus from Miami in 2019. When more than 24 hours passed with no sign of the young man, his mother, Flavia Tomasello, got the police involved and made it her personal mission to get to the bottom of the situation. Tomasello questioned members of the fraternity Antonio had just joined, Phi Kappa Psi, who claimed to know nothing of the teen's whereabouts, even though he had attended a party hosted by the group the previous night. 2 frat members, one who claimed he spent most of the evening at the library, and another who said that Antonio had gone to another party afterward, were both found to be lying. But being called out on their dishonesty did not initially make them any more willing to talk, leaving law enforcement and Tomasello largely on their own to figure out what had happened and where Antonio was. One of the first meaningful clues came when a witness told investigators that someone had poured vodka down Antonio's throat at a frat party the night he disappeared. At the very least, it indicated that the missing teen had been drinking heavily before he went missing, increasing the likelihood that he was in danger. And it was true. Antonio was in danger, but by the time his body was found in a shallow creek at the bottom of a nearby gorge 2 days after the party, it was far too late to save his life. His skull was fractured, several of his ribs were broken, and a toxicology test revealed that he died with a large amount of alcohol in his system. Antonio's death was still shrouded in mystery when campus officials announced that they were closing the case in 2020. In a statement, the university said it had disciplined dozens of students for hazing, and the fraternity was eventually kicked off campus. But these measures didn't provide Antonio's family with the answers they felt they needed in order to begin the excruciating process of healing from their son's untimely death. An analysis of the evidence by New York Times journalist Nicholas Bogle-Burrows pointed toward a culture of secrecy as a main factor in the lack of available information regarding the case. Simply put, the 100 or so fraternity members and guests who were at the party on the night of Antonio's death were unwilling to talk. Consequently, Antonio's death was ruled an accident resulting from a fall, but this failed to explain how he got to the ravine where his body was discovered, and perhaps more importantly, why. Officials believe the young man walked there himself before falling off a ledge. Nobody knows what happened to his phone, because it was never found. And as frat members lawyered up, their unwillingness to talk became solidified at the advice of their attorneys, making the search for answers even more difficult. Their lips remained sealed, even after Tomasello pleaded, reassuring the young men that her intention was not to put anyone in jail, but just to know what happened. Based on what information Tomasello and police were able to glean, it is known that Antonio was pledged into the fraternity despite a ban on initiating freshmen into Greek organizations during their first semester. The party he got fatally sick at was a Christmas in October themed bash, and other freshmen who were present reportedly admitted that they were pressured to drink, despite a stipulation claiming that there was no obligation to overindulge. Unfortunately, Antonio's loved ones remain in the dark about his final movements. Authorities were quick to rule out foul play, despite the obviously suspicious circumstances regarding how and where his body was found. The family settled a civil lawsuit against the school out of court for an undisclosed sum, along with a requirement that the university awards a scholarship in Antonio's name to an incoming freshman every year. In the meantime, all the family can do is hope that someone eventually clues them in to the events leading up to Antonio's death. And now for number 1, but if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. Josh Gimond. Over a 10-day period in 2002, 3 college-aged men vanished within a 170-mile distance of one another in Minnesota and Wisconsin. At first, many people suspected that the 3 cases were linked, but this proved unlikely after 2 of the men's bodies were found the following year. One of the men, Christopher Jenkins, was found in a river the following year. His death was ruled a homicide. Foul play was ruled out in the death of Michael Knoll, whose death was classified as an accidental drowning after his remains were found in a lake. Meanwhile, the disappearance of 20-year-old St. John's University student Joshua Gimond remains unsolved. Gimond was last seen playing cards at a party on campus in Collegeville, Minnesota. He got up and left around midnight without saying anything and never returned, but nobody seemed to notice that something was wrong until the teen failed to show up at a mock debate the next afternoon. It was soon discovered that Gimond never made it back to his dorm room that night, despite the party being just a 3-minute walk away, and he vanished without both his glasses and his car keys. A thorough police, canine and helicopter search of the area failed to turn up any sign of the missing young man. Just weeks earlier, Gimond and his high school sweetheart, Katie Benson, had broken up. The couple had started a year off together at the college and had split on seemingly amicable terms. Benson is not considered a person of interest in Gimond's disappearance. One theory holds that Gimond met with sudden tragedy at the party he was attending, possibly by accident, and the other guests co-conspired to cover up his death. Gimond's mother, Lisa Cheney, told the Netflix series Unsolved Mysteries that she believes this is possible. Others have speculated that Gimond was kidnapped, possibly by a serial killer, but this theory was largely dismissed after the deaths of Christopher Jenkins and Michael Knoll were found to be most likely unrelated to Gimond's case. A search of Gimond's computer revealed that he may have had a secret interest in men and that it somehow tied into his disappearance. According to detectives, he may have left the card game to meet someone he had connected with on the internet. It would perhaps explain why he didn't tell anyone where he was going, since he was most likely in the closet if it's true that he was exploring his sexuality. In 2022, law enforcement released a collage featuring the photos of 28 men they are trying to identify. They were interested in talking with the men to see if they know anything valuable about Gimond's possible whereabouts, and are hoping members of the public come forward with helpful information. For now, authorities are releasing limited details about their end of the case, since the investigation is ongoing, and while they have received tips from civilians in recent years, they still haven't landed on the information they need to figure out what happened to Gimond, who is presumed dead.
8. Natalie Bonnet. During the first stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, a 29-year-old Australian eyelash technician named Natalie Bonnet was stopped by police. She was making her way through a blockade in Wallen to get to work at the time, but that certainly didn't give her the go-ahead to bypass law enforcement. An officer told Bonnet that it was against the law to have her phone hooked to a car charger while attached to her windshield. He asked for her name and ID, but instead of handing it over, she asked to speak with a different officer instead, since the first one was making her feel deeply uncomfortable. Moments later, that same officer pulled Bonnet out of the vehicle while a passenger tried yanking her back inside. Bonnet later told 9 News that she didn't refuse to show her license, but that she simply refused to show it to that particular cop. She also said that she didn't feel safe getting out of the car, and that she didn't understand why the officer was even stopping her. If she knew that the cop was going to force her out of her vehicle, causing her clothes to rip and leaving her with scratches and bruises, Bonnet said she would have just followed orders. The woman denied allegations from social media commenters that she was a COVID conspiracy theorist and said that she actually suffers from anxiety. She learned the hard way that day that the rules apply to everyone. 7. Matthew Nicholson. It's not unusual for a grown man to throw a temper tantrum over a video game, but a 28-year-old California man named Matthew Nicholson took his anger way too far in 2018 after his gaming headset broke. A few days into the new year, officers responded to calls about a shooting at Matthew's home outside Modesto, where they found 68-year-old Lydia Nicholson clinging to life after being shot in the head. She passed away a short while later at a local hospital. According to investigators, Lydia heard Matthew yelling in his room and went to check on him. They argued, and at some point, Matthew lost his temper and broke his headset, which he immediately blamed his mother for. He threatened to kill his parents, then grabbed a handgun and shot Lydia in the head. A family friend told Fox 40 that Matthew also tried to shoot his 81-year-old father, Loren, but the weapon jammed. Loren wrestled the firearm away from his son and called 911 while the suspect fled to a relative's house. He was arrested later during a traffic stop. Matthew pleaded guilty to murder and assault with a firearm and was sentenced to 27 years in prison for the unnecessary attack. 6. Casey Garcia. 31-year-old Casey Garcia believes security at her daughter's middle school in El Paso County, Texas needed to be improved. So, she disguised herself as her child one day in 2021 and spent almost the entire day going to her daughter's classes before someone finally realized what was happening. She later said in a YouTube video that staff members seemed too preoccupied with monitoring students' phone use than confirming her identity. Given Garcia's petite 4'11", 105-pound frame, it's not surprising that she was mistaken for a child by most of the school's employees. But she found it concerning that it took so long for someone to take a close enough look to identify her. At one point, she even said she was the only person in the classroom, and the teacher still didn't realize she wasn't her daughter. In her video, the concerned mum apologized to the school district and its staff, stating that she thinks they're wonderful people and is sorry it had to be them. Garcia's message and other social media posts were meant to raise awareness, but they triggered a police investigation instead. Authorities charged her with criminal trespassing and tampering with government records. While the outcome of the case is unclear, it's probably safe to say that she went about her activism the wrong way and inadvertently focused the spotlight on herself instead of the school's shortcomings. 5. LaShawn Duffy. The exact nature of the relationship between 28-year-old LaShawn Duffy and 40-year-old Sergio Ramirez is unknown. But things went sour between the two in 2022 when Duffy got angry with Ramirez for sleeping around. He also suspected her of destroying some of his belongings, including comic books and a video game console. Instead of taking a rational approach and moving on with his life, Duffy seemed hell-bent on getting revenge. During the morning one day, he allegedly confronted Ramirez in front of her apartment in Brooklyn's Cypress Hills neighborhood and robbed her friend who was standing with her. According to prosecutors, Duffy then went out and bought twine, lighter fluid, and a lighter. Authorities believe he then returned and beat Ramirez up, tied her to a chair, dumped lighter fluid on her, and lit her on fire before leaving her to burn alive in the apartment. A witness reportedly saw the assault happen but failed to intervene. By the time emergency responders arrived, Ramirez was dead. Police finally tracked down and arrested Duffy over 2 months after the homicide. He was charged with first and second-degree murder as well as robbery. The case is still ongoing. 4. Kevin Love. Some basketball fans describe Kevin Love as a standout NBA player, while others are less impressed. Still, most agree that he's good at the sport and a valuable team member. Another thing people seem united on is their disgust at his immature and diva-like behavior during a few games in the 2019-2020 season. At the time, Love was a forward for the Cleveland Cavaliers and was caught in an ongoing feud with the team's coach, John Beilein, who was later replaced. On New Year's Eve 2019, Love lost his temper during a game against the Toronto Raptors and received a fine. Then, during a losing game against the Oklahoma City Thunders days later, he threw up his hands in disgust multiple times at his teammates, angrily firing a hard pass and turning his back on the defense. He also got into an argument with the team's manager, Kobe Altman, since he was mad about being fined for the Toronto game. Love initially accused the media of exaggerating the alleged heated nature of this conversation, which came during long-running rumors that he was going to be traded from the team. But he eventually realized his behavior was unacceptable and publicly apologized in a tweet, admitting that he was acting childish. He put the cringe-worthy series of bratty displays behind him and continued playing for the Cavaliers until early 2023, when he instead signed with the Miami Heat. 3. James Pack. In 2012, single mum Suzanne Johnson found what seemed like the perfect apartment for her and her 2 children after a difficult search. Located in Biddeford, Maine, it was attached to the home of her new landlord James Pack and his wife. They were an older couple who seemed easygoing and respectable. But it wasn't long before Pack began nitpicking Susan. He complained about where her son Derek Thompson parked his vehicle. When the boy's girlfriend, Olivia, spent the night, Pack accused the family of violating their rental agreement, which supposedly prohibited them from having people move in without permission. The fact that he paid close enough attention to notice the young woman made the family feel like their privacy was being violated, and as time went on, the landlord's complaints became more frequent and obsessive. He was also short-tempered, which seemed childish at first, but became increasingly threatening as his hatred of the tenants escalated. One day, Pack allegedly barged into the apartment and threatened Derek because he disapproved of the way the teen shoveled snow. Pack's wife, Amit, realized that her husband's behavior was irrational. She even apologized to Susan and her kids several times. But she was powerless to stop Pack from continuing his angry campaign. Susan and her kids soon realized that the only way to make the torment stop was to move. They couldn't find a new place to live overnight though, but they began searching. In the meantime, Pack decided he had to evict the family. One day, after a more explosive confrontation with her landlord, Susan called the police. She showed responding officers recordings of Pack's threats and harassment, but they told her to work things out in civil court. As they left, Pack yelled that he had nothing to lose, that they would see him in the newspaper soon, and that it's going to be a bloody mess. Despite being within earshot, the police simply left the scene. Just moments later, Pack entered Susan's apartment with a gun and started shooting. Susan was shot but survived, and her younger son hid in a back room. Derek and Olivia were unfortunately shot dead. Pack was charged with first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity but was found competent. To avoid making his family suffer through lengthy court proceedings, he pleaded guilty to all charges in early 2016 and got 2 life sentences. Even after admitting to his crimes, he never showed remorse, so he went to prison stubbornly believing that he was the true victim. 2. The tantrum at Stanford. In early 2023, students at Stanford Law, the second most prestigious law school in the US, invited US Circuit Court Judge Kyle Duncan to give a lecture called COVID, Guns, and Twitter. Duncan agreed to the discussion, which was meant to focus on how the decisions of his court have affected the higher Supreme Court. Of course, not everyone at the school agrees with the judge's decisions or the values they reflect. After all, it's impossible to agree with everyone, especially when it comes to politics and government. But instead of sitting through the lecture, the students who disliked Duncan complained to Tyrion Steinbach, the school's Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. In an email to the Stanford community, Steinbach wrote that Duncan repeatedly and proudly threatened healthcare and basic rights for marginalized communities, including LGBTQ+ people, Native Americans, immigrants, prisoners, black voters, and women. If that's true, it's understandable why some people didn't like him and didn't want him to speak at the university. But many people deny that Duncan supports prejudice policies, and while Steinbach clearly isn't a fan of the judge, she didn't take action to cancel his speaking engagement. She also said that she wasn't going to get in the way of students' right to protest and resolved to take a hands-off approach. Duncan tried in vain to give his speech, but was repeatedly drowned out by insults from protesters. There were 5 administrators present during the chaotic assembly, but none of them tried quieting the angry students down. When the judge asked officials to get the crowd under control, Steinbach spent several minutes delivering lamenting remarks from her portfolio, which included allegations that his presence was tearing at the fabric of the community, hurting students, and denying them of their rights. After trying and failing to get a word in for nearly 30 minutes, Duncan gave up. He later described the engagement as a therapy session from hell and said it felt like a setup. Like with all things political in the US, the incident deepened the divide between groups that hold opposing beliefs. Many people felt like Duncan got what he deserved, while others believe that his inability to deliver his thoughts represents a troubling restriction of free speech. The people who are angry at how the event turned out don't even necessarily share the same views as the judge, but they support his right to express himself freely, and they're equally troubled by the protesters' actions. The incident poses bigger questions on where to draw the line between rightfully shunning hateful speech and unfairly silencing someone because they might say something offensive but isn't necessarily illegal or explicitly prejudiced. 1. Amy Harrington. In 2022, 38-year-old Amy Harrington allegedly drove drunk one night and was almost home when she rear-ended another car in Madeira Beach, Florida. Responding deputies noticed that her eyes were glassy and red and that her pupils were very dilated, leading them to suspect that she was under the influence. According to an arrest report, Harrington struggled to follow simple instructions during a field sobriety test and was unsteady on her feet and almost falling when attempting to walk in a straight line. In body cam footage of the conversation, a deputy was heard asking Harrington to walk the line and then saying, "Do you want to pay attention so I can give you the instructions?" Harrington replied with a sarcastic tone, telling the deputy that he sounded like her dance coach. She proceeded to take 5 steps down the line and transitioned seamlessly into a drunken ballet sequence. Unamused, the deputy said, "That wasn't the exercise that I was demonstrating." His remark did little to stop Harrington from busting a move, as she changed up her style to what local news station WFLA described as a ballet/Irish folk hybrid dance. She later refused testing, similarly to how she behaved during a traffic stop in 2019, and she was charged with driving under the influence, with both property damage and refusal to submit to testing.
Thanks for watching. If you could do or redo your college experience from scratch, would you focus more on enjoying yourself during your last few years of freedom before becoming a full-fledged adult? Or would you pour all your effort into your studies in hopes of landing a lucrative and rewarding career that requires its candidates to be top-notch achievers? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.